January 1945. The cold sits low over the European countryside, clinging to steel and breath alike. Frost coats the ground, where tracks have already torn the earth apart. Inside a German Panzer, the engine idles, vibrating through bone and muscle. The crew waits, listening, watching. Then it begins. American tanks appear at the edge of the fields, not rushing, not clustered, but spaced, deliberate. One Sherman halts, another advances, a third shifts left, unseen behind a rise in the ground. There are no signal flags, no messengers running between vehicles, no visible orders at all. Yet they move together. To the German crew, it feels unnatural. Tanks are machines of noise and confusion, battles of smoke and guesswork. Coordination is slow. Commands are shouted or lost. But here, the Americans respond instantly. One Sherman fires, another repositions without hesitation. A third answers a threat the Germans haven't even revealed yet. Inside the Panzer, disbelief replaces confidence. How are they doing this? The answer is invisible, carried not by sight, but by sound. Voices traveling through static and wire, calm, clipped commands flowing from tank to tank. Radios turning chaos into choreography. And this moment, this quiet shock on a frozen battlefield, was not an accident. It was the result of years of hard lessons, painful failures, and a different way of thinking about how wars are fought. When the war began in 1939, armored warfare already carried a myth of perfection. The image was fast columns of tanks slicing through borders, radios crackling with precision, commanders always one step ahead. But the reality, on most battlefields, was far messier. The German army entered the war believing it had solved modern war. In Poland, then France, its armored formations appeared unstoppable. Tanks moved quickly, infantry followed closely, and aircraft carved paths through enemy rear areas. This approach would later be labeled blitzkrieg, but at its heart was something simpler: concentration, initiative, and communication. German doctrine emphasized momentum, and radios, where available, were tools to preserve it. But even in these early victories, communication was uneven. Only command tanks reliably carried radios. Many panzer crews still relied on hand signals, signal flags, or pre-arranged plans once combat began. This worked when the enemy collapsed quickly. It failed when resistance stiffened. The French army in 1940, though well equipped, struggled with rigid command structures. Orders moved slowly. Units waited for permission that never came in time. The German advantage was not superior machines. It was faster decision-making. Other armies watched and took notes. The Soviet Union absorbed the shock of German armor in 1941 and learned brutally. Early Red Army tanks often lacked radios entirely. Commands were delivered by runner or signal flare. Entire formations advanced blindly. Losses were catastrophic. Over time, the Soviets compensated with mass, endurance, and firepower. But communication remained a weakness well into the war. The United States entered this world late and unprepared. In 1941 and 1942, American armored doctrine was still experimental. Training emphasized individual vehicle performance more than coordinated maneuver. Radios existed, but they were not always standardized, not always reliable, and not always used effectively. Early American tanks were mechanically adequate, but doctrinally confused. That confusion became deadly clear in North Africa. When US forces first met German armor in Tunisia, the results were sobering. American units advanced piecemeal. Tank platoons lost contact with one another. Orders were misunderstood or delayed. German commanders exploited this mercilessly, striking isolated units and withdrawing before coordinated responses could form. Reports from the field were blunt. American tank crews were brave, but bravery did not compensate for confusion. Commanders could not see the battlefield. Platoons fought as individuals instead of teams. The problem was not courage or numbers, it was control. Behind the lines, the US Army listened. Officers analyzed every engagement. After-action reports filled filing cabinets. The conclusion emerged slowly, then unmistakably. Modern armored warfare was not won by armor thickness or gun caliber alone. It was won by tempo, and tempo depended on communication. The United States possessed one quiet advantage others did not: industrial standardization. If the army decided something mattered, it could be produced in enormous numbers, identical and interchangeable. Radios could become universal. Training could be standardized. Procedures could be drilled until instinct replaced hesitation. By late 1942, American doctrine began to shift. Tank platoons were no longer treated as loose collections of vehicles. They were units, linked by voice, guided by constant information. Commanders were encouraged to speak, not wait. Junior leaders were trusted to act. Radios were no longer accessories, they were lifelines. This transformation did not happen overnight. It required new equipment, new training manuals, and a cultural shift away from rigid hierarchy. But as American forces prepared to return to Europe, they carried something different with them. Not heavier tanks, not bigger guns, but a battlefield where every crew could hear the same war unfolding in real time. And soon, German tank crews would be the ones struggling to understand what they were facing. By 1943, the American army no longer believed that armored warfare could be improvised. The early defeats had stripped away illusions. What remained was a practical question: how to fight, survive, and win against an enemy that had been refining armored combat since the 1930s. The answer emerged not from a single breakthrough, but from standardization. At the center of this shift stood the M4 Sherman, not a revolutionary tank, but a reliable one. Its armor was moderate. Its gun was adequate, not dominant, but its true strength lay inside, unseen from the outside. Every Sherman rolled off the production line with a radio as standard equipment. Not just command vehicles. Every tank. Every crew. This decision alone marked a quiet departure from European practice. American planners understood something fundamental. Tanks rarely fight alone. They fight in platoons, companies, battalions, formations that must move and react as one. Without constant communication, these formations dissolved under fire. With it, they adapted. The radios chosen were robust, relatively simple to operate, and, most importantly, uniform. Crews trained on the same sets whether they were in Texas, England, or the hedgerows of France. Frequencies were standardized, call signs were drilled. Procedures were memorized until they became automatic. Inside a Sherman, the radio operator sat inches from the commander. Orders flowed instantly. A sighting, a warning, a correction, no waiting, no guessing. Training reflected this new reality. American armored divisions spent months rehearsing coordinated movement. Platoons practiced advancing by bounds, one element moving while another covered. Tank commanders were taught to talk constantly, even when nothing seemed to be happening. Silence was dangerous. Information, even incomplete, was better than ignorance. Just as important was who was allowed to speak. Unlike many European armies, the US emphasized initiative at the lowest levels. A platoon leader did not need permission to maneuver if he saw an opportunity or a threat. A tank commander could warn the platoon without routing the message through layers of command. Radios flattened the hierarchy, compressing decision time. German doctrine, by contrast, began to strain under the weight of the war. Early in the conflict, German armored units had benefited from experienced crews and confident leadership. But by 1943, losses were mounting. Veteran tankers were gone. Replacements arrived with less training and fewer hours behind the controls. Radios still existed, but they were not universal. Many German tanks carried receivers only, allowing them to hear orders, but not respond. Others relied on visual signals that vanished in smoke, darkness, or broken terrain. The battlefield itself had changed. In Normandy, Hedgerows cut sightlines to mere meters. In cities, buildings blocked visibility and amplified confusion. In forests and rolling hills, tanks lost contact with one another almost immediately. Visual coordination, once sufficient on open plains, collapsed. American units adapted faster because they could hear one another, even when they could not see. By the summer of 1944, US armored formations entering Europe were no longer experimental forces. They were practiced systems. Crews trusted their radios. Commanders expected constant updates. Orders were short, clear, and continuous. To German tank crews accustomed to fighting through smoke and guesswork, this behavior appeared uncanny. American tanks reacted too quickly. Maneuvers unfolded too smoothly. Ambushes were anticipated. Flanks were covered before threats fully materialized. The difference was not courage. It was not numbers. It was the invisible web connecting steel machines across shattered ground. And once the fighting began in earnest, that web would reveal itself, not as theory, but as lived battlefield shock. Because doctrine only matters when tested by fire. And the fire was coming. Inside a Sherman, the world was narrow and loud, steel walls pressed close. The engine roared inches away. Cordite lingered in the air long after the gun fired. Visibility came in fragments, through a periscope, a vision slit, a shouted report. But there was one constant presence: the radio. For American crews, the radio became a voice of reassurance in a violent, enclosed space. It carried the platoon leader's calm instructions. It carried warnings before danger appeared. It carried the knowledge that someone else was watching another sector, another hedgerow, another road. Young tank commanders, many barely in their 20s, learned to speak clearly even when fear crept in. Enemy armor, front. Hold position. Move left, now. These were not dramatic speeches. They were simple sentences. But in battle, simplicity saved lives. Trust formed quickly. Crews learned that when a voice came through the headset, it mattered. There was no time for debate. Radios reduced hesitation. They turned reaction into instinct. This mattered most under fire. When a Sherman took a hit, panic could spread in seconds. Smoke filled the compartment. The tank lurched, but the radio cut through it. Orders anchored crews to action. Pull back, pivot, cover another tank's withdrawal. Even damaged vehicles remained part of the fight as long as they could communicate. Isolation killed, connection sustained. American armored tactics evolved around this reality. In terrain where visibility collapsed, Norman hedgerows, wooded hills, shattered towns, platoons operated almost blind. Tanks could rarely see more than a few dozen yards. Yet they moved with coordination that defied the environment. Radios made this possible. A platoon advancing through hedgerows did not rely on line of sight. One tank advanced while another overwatched, guided not by what it saw, but by what it heard. When contact occurred, information traveled instantly. Positions were marked verbally. Fields of fire were adjusted in seconds. German units often fought what they could see. American units fought what they could hear. This allowed for rapid adaptation. A threatened flank could be reinforced before the enemy committed fully. A stalled advance could be redirected without stopping the entire formation. Even under artillery fire, units retained cohesion because commands did not depend on visual clarity. Coordination became fluid, continuous, almost conversational. The radios themselves were not glamorous. They crackled. They failed. They required discipline. But they worked often enough, and consistently enough, to shape outcomes. American training emphasized radio procedure as much as gunnery. Crews learned to speak briefly, clearly, and continuously. There was no room for confusion. Each word had weight. Redundancy was built in. If one tank lost contact, another relayed messages. German crews listening to intercepted chatter sometimes mistook this constant communication for higher command involvement. In reality, much of it came from junior leaders acting independently. coordinating on the move, adapting in real time. This decentralization unnerved opponents. It meant American units did not freeze when officers were killed. It meant momentum continued even when plans broke down. Radios turned every tank into both a weapon and a sensor, feeding information back into the formation. From the outside, it looked like orchestration. From the inside, it felt like survival. And it was only when German tank crews faced this system directly, under fire at close range, that the full implications became impossible to ignore. Because from their perspective, something was wrong. The Americans were reacting too fast. For German tank crews, the battlefield had always been a place of controlled chaos. Orders arrived before combat. Once the fighting began, much depended on experience, eyesight, and instinct. Hand signals, flags, pre-arranged maneuvers. When conditions were right, it worked. But by 1944, conditions were rarely right. Inside many German Panzers, radios were limited. Some tanks could receive orders but not transmit. Others relied on a single command vehicle to relay instructions visually. Smoke, terrain, and noise quickly erased those connections. Once contact was lost, crews fought alone. Then they encountered American units. German tankers reported something unsettling. US Shermans maneuvered as if guided by an unseen hand. A German tank would shift position, only to find its new location already covered. A flanking attempt would be met almost immediately. Not minutes later, not after confusion, but at once. To crews accustomed to visual coordination, this felt unnatural. The Americans did not expose themselves to communicate. They did not pause. They reacted as a group without ever appearing to regroup. Interrogations of German prisoners later revealed the same observation, repeated in different words. The Americans spoke constantly. They knew where each other were. They adjusted too quickly to be improvising blindly. The battlefield no longer rewarded experience alone. It rewarded connectivity. This difference reflected a deeper contrast in command philosophy. German doctrine prized decisive leadership, but it also depended heavily on experienced officers and NCOs. As casualties mounted, that experience vanished. Replacement crews lacked the confidence to act independently. Without clear orders, they hesitated. American doctrine moved in the opposite direction. US armored units trained junior leaders to act on incomplete information. Platoon leaders were expected to make decisions without waiting for approval. Radios made this possible. A commander did not need a full picture, only enough shared information to keep the formation coherent. This decentralized control shocked opponents. Killing a single American officer did not halt movement. Orders continued to flow. Another voice filled the channel. The formation adapted and pressed forward. Leadership became distributed, flexible, resilient. War is as much rhythm as violence. Whoever controls tempo controls fear. German tank crews increasingly found themselves reacting instead of initiating. Each move seemed anticipated. Each pause punished. The Americans did not wait for perfect conditions. They moved, adjusted, and spoke through the chaos. This constant pressure wore on morale. Uncertainty is exhausting. Not knowing where the enemy is, only that they are communicating, creates anxiety. German crews described feeling watched, outmaneuvered, and compressed. Even superior tanks lost their advantage when they fought blind against a coordinated opponent. The realization settled slowly, then firmly. The Americans were not winning because their tanks were better. They were winning because they were never alone. And once that truth became clear, the battlefield itself began to shift. Because there comes a moment in every campaign when one side understands that the old rules no longer apply. That moment, sharp, violent, undeniable, was approaching. The decisive moment did not arrive with a single explosion. It unfolded in minutes, measured in transmissions, reactions, and split-second decisions. Normandy, summer 1944. The hedgerows turned every advance into a gamble. Earthen walls rose higher than the tanks themselves, blocking sight and funneling movement into narrow gaps. German crews knew this terrain well. They waited in ambush positions, engines silent, guns trained on likely exits. A German Panther lay concealed behind a hedgerow bend. Its gun covered a sunken lane. The plan was simple: destroy the lead tank, sow confusion, withdraw before retaliation. The first Sherman appeared. The Panther fired. The American tank erupted in flames, smoke pouring skyward. In earlier campaigns, this would have been the moment of paralysis, the moment when a column stopped, unsure of what had happened or where the shot came from. This time, it was different. Before the smoke fully settled, voices filled the airwaves. Calm, fast, overlapping, but controlled. Hit! Front! Enemy armor, hedgerow right! Second section, flank left, now! The column did not stop. It bent. One Sherman reversed immediately, clearing the lane. Another pushed forward, not into the kill zone, but to draw fire. A third tank, previously unseen by the German crew, was already moving through a parallel field, guided entirely by radio instructions. The Panther fired again, missed. Within seconds, American tanks were no longer reacting. They were maneuvering. Smoke rounds were deployed without orders from higher command. One tank pinned the German position. Another relayed precise grid references. The flanking Sherman emerged exactly where the Panther crew did not expect it. From the German perspective, the ambush had failed almost instantly. There had been no time to signal withdrawal, no chance to coordinate with supporting units. The Panther crew saw silhouettes shifting in places they had not targeted, responding to information they could not see being shared. The flanking Sherman fired. The Panther was hit in the side. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. Afterward, American crews reported the incident in clipped radio logs. No dramatics, no confusion. The platoon reformed, adjusted its route, and continued the advance. For the German survivors watching from nearby positions, the message was unmistakable. The Americans were no longer advancing blindly into traps. They were dissolving them in real time. This was the turning point. Not a single battle, but a realization spreading across the front. German defensive tactics, built on surprise and localized superiority, were being neutralized by coordination that did not depend on sight, proximity, or pause. Every ambush now carried risk. Every engagement invited immediate response. And as these encounters multiplied, German commanders began to understand the deeper danger. They were not facing isolated tanks. They were facing a system, one that could absorb shock, share information, and strike back before fear had time to spread. The next engagements would only confirm it. Because once momentum shifts, it rarely returns quietly. As summer turned to autumn, encounters like this ceased to feel exceptional. They became routine. Across France, then into Belgium and Western Germany, German armoured units noticed the same pattern repeating itself. Engagements began on German terms: ambushes, defensive positions, carefully selected ground, but ended on American ones. The window between contact and response narrowed until it nearly vanished. German after-action reports began to reflect a subtle shift in language. Where once they described enemy movements as hesitant or disorganized, new words appeared: schnell, koordiniert, ununterbrochen, fast, coordinated, continuous. American armored units did not pause to regroup after losses. They redistributed responsibility. If a platoon leader was killed, another voice took over. If a tank was destroyed, the formation adjusted its spacing without halting. Radios ensured the fight did not fragment. This mattered most during moments of chaos. In the fall of 1944, during fluid fighting in the Lorraine region, German units attempted mobile defense, counter-attacking exposed American spearheads before withdrawing again. Against less coordinated forces, this tactic had worked. Against American units linked by constant communication, it faltered. A German counterattack might achieve local surprise, but surprise no longer lasted. Within seconds of contact, information rippled outward. Adjacent platoons altered their movement. Supporting units shifted fire. Artillery requests followed quickly, guided by real-time updates rather than delayed observation. German tank crews found themselves engaging not a single threat, but a growing web of responses. During the winter fighting, when weather degraded visibility further, the advantage became even clearer. Snow, fog, and darkness erased visual cues entirely. For German crews reliant on sight and signal, this was paralyzing. For American units, radios became the primary sense organ. Tank commanders fought by voice. One engagement blurred into the next. German crews withdrew earlier, fired fewer rounds, abandoned more vehicles intact. The psychological impact deepened. Even heavily armored German tanks, technically superior on paper, struggled to exploit their strengths when surrounded by coordinated movement they could not fully track. By the time of the Ardennes fighting, this difference was no longer theoretical. American units, often outmatched in armor and initially surprised, regained cohesion rapidly through communication. Counterattacks formed faster. Defensive lines stabilized sooner than German planners anticipated. What German crews couldn't believe was not that Americans used radios. It was how completely they trusted them. There was no visible hesitation, no pause to confirm orders. Voices carried authority, even when they came from junior ranks. The battlefield moved at the speed of speech. By early 1945, the turning point had passed fully into history. German armored forces were fighting a war where information moved faster than steel, where initiative belonged to those who could coordinate under pressure, and when the guns fell silent after these engagements, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Because battles do not end when firing stops. They end when one side understands what it has lost. When the fighting moved on, the evidence remained scattered across the landscape. Burned-out tanks sat at awkward angles in fields and roadways. Abandoned vehicles still carried full ammunition racks. Tracks led away from positions that had been carefully prepared, then suddenly vacated. These were not the signs of a force overwhelmed by firepower alone. They were signs of a force that had lost cohesion. For American armored units, the change was measurable. Losses still occurred. Shermans still burned. Crews still died. But formations recovered faster. Advances resumed sooner. Operations that once stalled for hours now pressed forward, after minutes. Commanders noted that platoons remained intact, even after taking casualties, not physically, but functionally. Radio coordination had altered the rhythm of combat. After-action reports repeatedly emphasized the same themes: rapid dissemination of information, flexible response, uninterrupted momentum. Tank crews described engagements where they never fully saw the enemy, yet felt constantly informed. Knowledge replaced visibility. This translated directly into operational results. By late 1944, American armored divisions were advancing deeper and faster than planners had initially projected. German delaying actions bought less time. Counterattacks achieved diminishing returns. Defensive lines, once expected to hold for days, fractured within hours. German armored losses reflected this shift. Vehicles were destroyed not only in direct engagements, but during withdrawals that came too late or too early. Crews abandoned tanks because coordination had collapsed, not because ammunition was exhausted. Prisoner interrogations revealed a growing sense of inevitability. German tankers spoke of being pressed from multiple directions almost immediately after contact. They described battles where they felt engaged by an entire formation rather than a single opponent. This perception mattered. It eroded confidence in tactics that had once worked. Ambushes felt risky. Holding ground felt dangerous. Even successful engagements invited retaliation that arrived faster than expected. For American crews, the radio became more than equipment. It became identity. Tankers spoke of knowing voices before faces. Platoon leaders recognized individual commanders by tone alone. In combat, familiarity bred trust, and trust reduced hesitation. That trust allowed American units to exploit opportunities without waiting for perfection. At higher levels, commanders took note. Armored doctrine was quietly rewritten in practice. Communication was no longer a support function. It was central. Artillery, infantry, and armor coordination increasingly relied on the same principles proven inside tank platoons: constant updates, decentralized decision-making, and shared awareness. This did not make American units invincible, but it made them resilient. And resilience, in a war of exhaustion, mattered more than brilliance. As the front pushed eastward and the fighting intensified, these lessons followed every column and convoy. They shaped how the final months of the war were fought, not just tactically, but psychologically. Because by this stage, German forces were no longer asking how to stop American tanks. They were asking how to slow something that no longer seemed to break apart. In the months that followed, the implications of this shift extended beyond the battlefield itself. German military assessments conducted late in the war and immediately afterward increasingly highlighted communication as a decisive American strength. Not in isolation, but as a force multiplier that compensated for technical shortcomings. Superior armor and guns mattered less when they could not be brought to bear in time or in coordination. The war's end froze these lessons into doctrine. For the United States Army, armored combat had been redefined. The experience of 1944 and 1945 confirmed that information flow was as critical as firepower. Post-war training emphasized command, control, and communication as inseparable elements of combat effectiveness. Radios became more reliable, more secure, and more integrated, not only in tanks, but across combined arms formations. Other armies took notice. The German army, reconstituted years later, adopted many of the same principles. The Soviet Union accelerated efforts to equip all armored vehicles with radios and to train crews in continuous communication. NATO doctrine, shaped by American wartime experience, placed heavy emphasis on interoperability and shared situational awareness. The Sherman itself faded from the battlefield, but its legacy endured. It had proven that a good enough platform, when fully connected, could outperform technically superior machines operating in isolation. This lesson resonated far beyond World War II. In later conflicts, from Korea to the Cold War standoffs in Europe, the emphasis on communication only deepened. Commanders understood that speed of decision, not just speed of movement, defined success. Radios evolved into digital networks, data links, and real-time battlefield management systems. Yet the core principle remained unchanged from those hedgerows and frozen fields. A force that can speak continuously can adapt continuously. German tank crews in 1944 had not lost because they lacked courage or skill. They lost because the battlefield had changed around them faster than their systems could adapt. The enemy no longer needed to see to act. By the time the war ended, this realization had reshaped armored warfare permanently. And with that realization came a quieter truth, one that often escapes attention in histories focused on machines and victories. Wars are not only decided by what can be built or destroyed, they are decided by what can be shared. And in the final months of World War II, the ability to share information instantly, reliably, and under fire became one of the most decisive weapons of all. That truth lingers long after the engines fall silent. When the war ended, the fields fell quiet, long before the lessons faded. Across Europe, rusting hulls and broken tracks marked where machines had clashed, but the most important changes were invisible. They lived in doctrine manuals, training fields, and the habits of men who had learned what mattered when chaos took over. The American Sherman was never the most feared tank of the war. It did not dominate through armor or firepower. It endured through connection, through voices cutting across fear and noise, binding scattered machines into something cohesive. German tank crews had faced powerful enemies before. What unsettled them in 1944 was not strength, but certainty. The Americans seemed to know what was happening, always, everywhere. That knowledge did not come from sight alone. It came from trust in communication and from a system built to keep information moving even when everything else failed. World War II marked the moment when warfare crossed a quiet threshold. Coordination became continuous. Decision-making accelerated. Isolation became fatal. The battlefield no longer rewarded the lone superior machine. It rewarded the network. Today's armored formations operate with tools those Sherman crews could not imagine: satellites, digital maps, instantaneous data feeds. But the principle remains unchanged. Technology amplifies human judgment only when it connects it. In the end, the story is not about radios or tanks or tactics. It is about how people adapt under pressure, how trust replaces fear, and how a voice, steady, calm, and shared, can turn uncertainty into action. On those frozen roads and hedgerow-lined fields, German tank crews learned a hard truth. The future of warfare had already arrived.